Hello and welcome to another installment of Adventist Pioneers. These videos are not directed at Jewish people. These videos are directed at my Adventist friends who have asked me questions of why I left the church, but most importantly, directed to those who have Jewish and Israelite heritage who are wondering what is the next step in their reformation. But most importantly, it's because of the questions and interests that I've received with regards to Adventist history. What was the actual motive of the Adventist movement? And the reason why I get myself to do these videos and or answer through these videos is because I'm a former Adventist and I'm not apologetic about it. Quick disclaimer, these are not Jews evangelizing Christians or converting Christians to Judaism. But if you have Jewish heritage or Israelite heritage and you're in Adventism, this is going to be very interesting and relevant to you as to when are you going to finish your Reformation. The Christian Reformation, I believe, is something that God set off because the church had forcefully converted Jews to Christianity. It had also introduced, or Rome introduced, heresies that forced our people to make ill-thought decisions to become Christians and end up in idolatry. And so there are a lot of Jews in Christianity, not just in Seventh-day Adventism. It's funny because when I was an Adventist and doing missionary work and studying abroad, I was surrounded by Jewish Adventists, and I didn't even know at that time. And I got to discover through conversation that they were Jewish. I didn't understand the significance of it then. But soon after I discovered this, the Adventist church went into a ministry mode to retain Jews in the church. And that happened through a synagogue within the church called Beit B'nai Zion. Beit B'nai Zion is nothing but Hebrew roots. And Hebrew roots is not only typical to Adventism, does not come from Adventism. It comes from the evangelical churches that want to retain Jews who are Christian, who keep wanting to go back to the Torah, to keep them in Christianity by giving them a Jewish ministry. So by the time we get to Seventh-day Adventism and Beit B'nai Zion, this has been happening all over the Protestant Christian world. These days in Hebrew movements, you don't even have to be Protestant to get completely Hebrew Christian churches. And Messianic Judaism is not Judaism either. It is Christianity. It's Hebrew Christianity that includes Jewish things. I know a lot of people are going to probably react sharply and attack me for seemingly attacking Messianic Judaism, but Messianic Judaism is also an important phase for a Jew that's leaving Christianity to unlearn a lot of the things that are not correct, doctrines, and then transitioning to a Jewish way. And then with the light of God and the Torah, I bet you my last $20 they're going to move on to traditional Judaism because they will see the way home. So that's why I always say that Seventh-day Adventism is a penultimate step of the Reformation. It's not the final step. The final step of the Reformation is Messianic Judaism, which is still Christianity, but it introduces real Judaism, even though it's Christian. And then from there, you move on. If by the revelation of God, you go back to traditional Judaism. This happens immediately. For some people, it takes time because they have to understand what's going on in the religious world and in their minds, because not everyone has the privilege to study theology as I have studied religion and theology and know exactly the deceptions of the religious world and the politics of the religious world. So in this video, we're going to start looking at the beliefs of the other Adventist pioneers. You must remember that Seventh-day Adventism stands on 28 beliefs. And all of these beliefs can be traced somehow to a certain pioneer. Strangely enough, no belief in the Adventist pillars is attributed to Ellen G. White. This is also confirmed by the best theologian that Adventism has ever had and will ever have. This is Pastor Ford from Australia. The church fired him and called him a heretic. But Desmond Ford was the best theologian in all of Christianity and not just Seventh-day Adventism. This was my judgment of him when I was still studying theology and still in church. I thought he was the best theologian the Christian world missed out on. Never mind the Adventist world. And so we're going to look at what I was trying to say is Ellen White never contributed to the beliefs, but people like James White and other elders did. So we're going to look at Elder Waggoner first. In the previous videos, I showed you William Miller, what was happening in his mind, how he came to believe in what he believed, how he created the foundation for Seventh-day Adventism. In this video, we're going to look at other pioneers. Now we are looking at Elder Waggoner. But before we go and see what Elder Waggoner believed and proposed, we need to go into Christian history. Because you must remember, Seventh-day Adventism does not exist in a vacuum. Seventh-day Adventism has its foundation in evangelical Christianity, which has its foundation in Protestantism. And evangelical Christianity comes from Germany, and it comes with a lot of racial and social ideologies. So that's why it's not surprising for us in South Africa to have experienced racism from the inception of Adventism in this country. This video is not to beat down the Adventists, but to explain why things were. I was in the church and I asked myself, why is this church, if it loves me so much, if I have to sacrifice so much for it in tithes, in becoming a missionary, in evangelizing people, making them Adventist, but why is it racist against me? The problem is in the fundamentals, it's in the foundation. Because it comes from evangelical ideology, which comes from Germany, and consequently, German Christianity brought us the Holocaust and the murder of 6 million Jews. I'm not saying Adventism, I'm saying that evangelical Christianity and its ideologies brought us that. Because when Jews were being murdered and killed, the Germans were singing Christian hymns. They were truly singing the Christian hymns while watching Jews being gassed, burnt. They really thought they were soldiers of the cross. They really thought they were doing God a favor. So let's see the foundations of Christian theology. Let us look into the foundations of the New Testament before we can understand why the Adventist pioneers wanted to have a revival. Give us a revival. Give us the Spirit. Where does this all come from? We're not dealing with the New Testament yet, but we are dealing with just the foundations of Christian theology. In view of Adventism, we're not even talking about theology yet. Only in future lectures will I go into theology. So let me start sharing my screen. And I want to share with you my PDF. Alrighty. So it's important for me to tell you that I have never seen in an Adventist seminary people being taught Christian history. When you talk about Adventist theology, it's always about what Ellen White said or taught. Not even the pioneers, it's all about Ellen White. Yet the pillars of the church come from the teachings of its, or the beliefs of its pioneers. So let's look at the foundations of the basics of basic Christianity. And I choose to start with Marcion. Remember, we're not doing Christian history here. When we do Christian history, I will start at the beginning of this book. And I think that will be a series that will take us maybe a year or two. But stay on this channel. We're going to be learning a lot of things, whether it's religion or science. That's my specialty, both worlds. So let's look at the book I'm reading from is an amazing historical treatise. It's called Church History, Volume 1, From Christ to the Pre-Reformation Era. This is book 1. Book 2 of Christian history, which is what you read to get your degree in theology, deals with the Reformation to present day. So I decided to relinquish the opportunity of having a degree in religious studies because the last year of my university dealt with Christian theology. And by this time, I had gone back to Judaism and I had no appetite to read the content of my degree because I didn't study theology so that I could have a degree. I wanted to know the truth. I did it for myself and I did it for my family so that everybody could walk on the correct path and we could find our way back to God and to the faith of our forefathers, which happens to be Judaism. Marcion. It begins by saying, it may be unconventional to start with Marcion. So, question mark, who was Marcion? Marcion is one of the church fathers. It may be unconventional to start with Marcion, but his basic position is easier to grasp than that of the Gnostics. This is not to say that there are no problems in interpreting Marcion, and his seems to have been a strictly religious approach without the speculative interests of many of the Gnostics. So far we've had the mention of the Gnostics 2 times. Who were the Gnostics? The Gnostics were a spiritual group that grew out of the Greco-Roman world in Judea. Because you must remember, Judea, the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, these were occupied, especially Judea, not so much Samaria. Samaria in the north, the northern kingdom tended to be occupied by Syria, but sometimes by Greeks and Romans too. But Judea was colonized by the Greeks first. Some of them never left. The Romans came, not only soldiers, but civilians. So this whole idea of a Greco-Roman society is an addition of Gentiles onto Jewish land. So the Jews, especially the rabbis, during the time of the development of Christian history, the Jewish rabbis, the Tanaim, were busy compiling the Talmud, which is the preservation of Judaism. Judaism, by definition, is the Bible, which is in the Jewish Bible, it's Genesis to 2nd Chronicles. In the Christian Bible, that would be Genesis to Malachi. Because God didn't give us a New Testament, and you're going to see why I say that. And therefore, the definition of Judaism is the Torah plus the Talmud. The Torah tells us what to do and who God is. The Talmud explains the essence of God, the essence of Judaism, and what we should do as people who want to serve God. That's why the church hated the Talmud so much, because it destroyed the gospel. But let me not talk too much. I was explaining the Gnostics, that they were an esoteric groups, people who had visions and apparitions. They were spiritual, but they were not based on the Torah. They were considered heretics by Jews and also by Christians. But funny enough, the book of Revelation in the New Testament is pure Gnosticism. But let me read and you'll find out. Marcion started from the distinctiveness of the Christian revelation, and he established a new church, something most other early heretics did not do. So Marcion focuses on Christian revelation. There's a reason why there's a book called the Revelation, because it talks about the 7 churches that are in the European territory, or the Roman territory, beginning with Turkey, or in those days it was called Asia Minor. So the book of Revelation talks about the 7 churches. It borrows Jewish symbolism like the menorah and the Messiah and the number 7, but it mixes it with Christian aspirations and also mixes it with Gnosticism, which are the foundation of the New Testament. And he established a new church, something most other heretics did not do. What does it mean, a new church? So by the time Marcion is alive, between the 4th and 5th century, the Church of Rome already existed back in Rome, because remember, Constantine had converted to Christianity in around 325. Or actually not converted, but adopted Christianity and made it a state religion. So the Church of Rome already had its church. And the Church of Rome quickly started producing a New Testament, because the first New Testament manuscripts were produced in the first 300 years of Christianity. By the 4th century, New Testament comes out, and by the 5th century or the 6th, then a complete Bible that has a New Testament and Old Testament is kind of produced, but not published yet. It'll be published when would it be published, actually? In the Middle Ages, I think. You can double check me on that one. Rabbi Google might help. So Marcion started from the distinctiveness of the Christian revelation, and he established a new church, something that other heretics did not do. His church rivaled the great church, which is Rome, and lasted until the 5th century. So Rome was also trying to rewrite Jewish history as punishment for the Jews for having revolted throughout since the year 60 of the Common Era, right through to 120 with Bar Kokhba. So all these polemics like Judas and whatever, these are polemics against the Jews. They never really happened. So Marcion was rivaling Rome in theology. And Marcion had a distinct advantage because he didn't live in Rome. He lived in the Holy Land, so he could develop an antithesis to the church. Marcion has enough in common with the labeled Gnostics. So Marcion's thinking and theologizing has to do with heretics called the Gnostics, to be a good introduction, but enough difference to belong in a class of himself. In discussing Jewish Christianity, we found certain extremes coming from the Jewish influences. In Marcion, we find extremes from the Gentile side. Marcion took a position decidedly opposing the Jewish roots of Christianity. So let me explain what's going on here. So you have the Church of Rome, and then you have Marcion as a church father. He's busy theologizing. Rome is not interested in Christianity, even though they adopted it as a official state religion. They are interested in the politics, using the religion to conquer the world, using the concoction of the gospel in order to peacefully make nations submit. And this is how Rome conquered the world. From that time until the Middle Ages, which is the time of the discovery of the New World and the conquest of all the lands, the New Worlds, which brings us to colonization and slavery and all those delicious things that the church did. But we get a feeling that church doctrine had not yet been established. And you must also remember that during this time, the popes had not arisen yet. So there were no popes yet. And the church's name had not yet changed to Roman Catholic Church. This comes later. So Marcion has enough in common with the Gnostics to be a good introduction, but enough difference to belong to a class to himself, or to belong in a class to himself. That's weird English. It should be to belong to a class of his own, or to be a class himself. Interesting grammar. In discussing Jewish Christianity, we've found certain extremes coming from Jewish influences. So during this time, we have Rome with its own political agenda of rewriting Jewish history, to further enslave the Jewish people and to take them away from the Torah. We have Marcion, who is propagating Christian revelations, which would become the New Testament. At the same time, there are Jews who had followed the Gentiles in believing in Jesus, but now they realize, this movement is not good. It's taking us away from Judaism. And 200 years after Jesus, there is a schism, a separation between the Greco-Roman disciples of the Jewish disciples of Jesus. So Judaism and this Christianity part ways because Marcion begins to sow a seed of division and hatred, and also Gnosticism, which means idolatry, basically, into the Jewish world, or into what was called then the Nazarene movement. You must remember that the word Christianity does not exist until the 4th century in Turkey. So during the time of Marcion, it still wasn't Christianity. It was a Nazarene movement. But in this historical treatise, in this book that we are reading, it is called Christianity because this is Christian history. So in Marcion, we find extremes from the Gentile side. Marcion took a position decidedly opposing the Jewish roots of Christianity. This is where he started hating the Jews and coming up with a replacement theology, saying that the Jews were not anymore the preferred people of God. The Gentiles had become the church, which replaces Judaism or the people of Israel. But we know in Isaiah chapter 60, this is not true. God is mad with Israel for having done idolatry and the Jewish people. But from chapter 60 onwards, God promises restoration and to love the Jewish people and reinstate them again and to renew a covenant with them as he had made with Abraham as his people and a group of people which God will bless the nations through. So God never forsook. He had never forsaken the Jewish people. He was mad at the Jewish people and Israel, our ancestors, but he never forsook them. So Marcion is saying, well, anyway, I hate this Old Testament. It's time for something new. These Jews have failed. We can do better. Marcion was reared in Sinope in Pontus, where his father was reportedly a bishop. He was a shipbuilder and acquired considerable wealth. The false teaching opposed in the New Testament letter to the Colossians and Docetic ideas current in Asia Minor, which is Turkey, may have been part of his religious background. So he was not just a Gnostic, but he was a polemic individual. He created his own beliefs through his own spirituality and not according to the Torah or the spirituality of the Jewish people. An anti-Jewish sentiment associated with Bar Kokhba revolt in Palestine in the 130s likely influenced him, although his basic perspective may have developed earlier. So the Jews always revolted, thank God, and this was a thorn in the side for the Greco-Romans, for the colonists. So Marcion didn't really like the Jews because these conquered people cannot stay conquered. And even if we come with better spiritual interpretations for their own religion, they don't accept it, these Jews. So that's where anti-Semitism comes from. That's where the anti-Jewish sentiment comes from, and Jew hatred. Both because Rome could never conquer the Jewish people in terms of their souls and their fidelity to God. Marcion went to Rome and gave the church a large sum of money, basically a bribe. His teachings, however, were rejected in 144 and his money was returned to him. He proceeded to set up a rival church that in a few years was nearly as widespread as the great church. Now let's go back to the book of Revelation, to the 7 churches which are in Asia Minor. There's a church in Rome, but also there's a church in the Roman territories, compliments of the church fathers, specifically Marcion. Marcion's wealth and organizing ability enabled him to take over some of the emerging Gnosticizing groups. So in the land of Israel, not only this new Christian belief, which was called the Nazarene Judaism, but now after the separation of the Jews, what is predominant is not Jewishness or Jewish things or Torah, but Gnosticizing, a false spirituality and prophecy. but the organizing and worship of his community to have been similar to that of the great church, which means Rome. Marcion is known for his work on the text and canon of the New Testament. Can you see? Marcion, it says in the Christian history book, it says Marcion is known for his work on the text and canon of the New Testament. So you have this person who's writing the New Testament and putting it into canon, which means he organizes the sequence of the Gospels. So the Gospels do not come from Jesus. The Gospels do not come from the Jewish people. They don't come from the Bible. They are man-made. The New Testament is man-made in order to rival God's real Bible, which is Genesis to Malachi in the Christian version, or Genesis to Second Chronicles in the original Tanakh. Marcion, he rejected the Old Testament as scripture for the church and issued a New Testament. So the New Testament comes from who? It comes from Marcion. When Messianic Jews and Christians want to justify a Brit HaChadasha, or a New Testament, doing away with the Old Testament, this is Jew hatred politics. It's not biblical. It's politics to hate the Jews, to say your God is not good enough for the church. Because you must remember, the Old Testament consists of 3 series of books. It's the Torah, which is infallible. It's the wisdom writings, which are not infallible, and the prophecies, which are not infallible. What do I mean by not infallible? Is there something wrong with them? No. It means that the wisdom writings are not binding. It means that the prophecies don't have to happen the way that they've been prophesied. They're not binding, but the Torah is binding, because the wisdom writings and the prophecies, they have their foundation in the Torah. The Torah is the original Bible. It's a real deal. It is the character of God. So Marcion is rejecting the character of God and saying the character of God is not good for the church. We need a New Testament. This Jesus now is the new God. It says here, he rejected the Old Testament as scripture, for the church had issued a New Testament consisting of edited versions of the Gospel of Luke and 10 Pauline epistles, lacking the pastoral epistles. So we are not talking about a person that's editing existing text. We are talking about the author of the New Testament. It's not Luke, it's not John, it's not who, it's not this, it's not Jesus, it's Marcion. And then whatever gospel existed at that time in bits and pieces, he edited it for the churches. So the faith of the churches is not built even on Jesus. It's built on Gnosticism, which is a man-made spirituality, which has no foundation in the Torah. And now we can see the New Testament is a fabrication of a human. He omitted, it doesn't come by divine inspiration. He omitted or changed verses, often on a dogmatic basis, which means depending on what doctrine he wanted to sell. His is the oldest known fixed collection of the New Testament books. He wrote the antithesis, presenting the contradictions between the Old and the New Testament, in which his theology is set forth. When the New Testament says that the Jews killed Jesus, it is not even history that's speaking that. It's the voice of a man named Marcion who hated the Jews. But also Rome took this New Testament and put it into their Roman Bible that we call the Holy Bible today, because it suits their agenda of doing away with the Jews. So you go to a church, the Jews killed Jesus, and the church persecuted Jews for 2,000 years for something they did not do. We know that the work primarily from the 5 books, from the 5-book refutation by Tertullian against Marcion. Marcion's theology has been described as an exaggerated Pauline gospel of grace. But now we know that even the Pauline gospel is a concoction. It was never Jewish, but because the church fathers, they were disciples of the Jewish disciples of Jesus, they knew a little bit of Judaism, so they wrote their own Gnostic version of Judaism, and that's what became the New Testament. And that's what became the Brita Chadasha, a false new covenant, and that became an addition to the Roman Bible, not just in Marcion's Christian world, which is in Asia, which is in Judea and Asia Minor. The following points reflect the basic views of Marcion as they can be reconstructed from the criticism leveled against him by his opponents in the ancient church. Let me see if we're still recording here. Yep, we're still recording. That's good. So it says here, these are the following points that reflect his basic views. We're not going to go through all of them because this is not a lecture about Christian history yet. In a different series, one day we're going to take these two books, Christian History Volume 1 and Volume 2, and make them into a series. But for now, we're only concerned with this part of Christian history so that we can understand the theological understanding and propositions of Adventist pioneers. So let me carry on here a little bit. Marcion believed or proposed that there are two gods. In Exodus 20, the first commandment that God gives us is that you will not have any other gods except for me. That is the very first thing. But Marcion, because he hates the New Testament and the Jews and the God of the Old Testament, which is God, the only God, the creator. So he says there are two gods. Moses, our great teacher, peace be upon him, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9, it is written, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, in Hebrew, which means, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. But because Marcion is a Gnostic, a spiritist, a divinator, he says that there are two gods, the creator and the redeemer God. So he's referring to some sort of, he's not even referring to the God of Israel, because Marcion understands Jesus to be the creator too, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll see. So he says there's a creator God and a redeemer God, and this is not true because the Bible says there's one God. Marcion's dualism seems not to have been a metaphysical matter, but an inference from a human experience of contradictions in life. So this opens the mind of Marcion to us. Marcion did not have, even though he was a spiritist, he did not have spiritual and metaphysical aspirations, because you must remember, metaphysics is not magic. It's what happens outside the earth spiritually. Metaphysics are in the Bible everywhere in Genesis. So he was not concerned with the spiritual, but the physical. And that's a big, big alarm. But also people who are attached to the physical world and physical things, they are classic idolaters that want to make idols out of physical things, such as making a god out of Jesus, and also have a statue of that same Jesus. This is the New Testament. Coming from Marcion, not from me, comes from Marcion. Law and judgment belong to the Creator, which means the one who creates everything, and redemption is the work of the Father, says Marcion, the unknown or strange God. I want you to know that the New Testament is the product of a hatred of the Torah and the hatred of the God of Abraham. Because when Marcion considers God unknown and strange, especially in the book of, is it Romans, where Paul supposedly goes to a Greek city, Athens, and he sees a statue to an unknown God, and then he gets philosophical about this unknown God. This is pure idolatry. It's got nothing to do with the Jewish world or the God of Abraham. The Old Testament is the revelation of the Creator. So Marcion admits that the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible is the revelation of the Creator. It's the Bible. And then he continues to say it predicts the Jewish Messiah. The Jews have read their scriptures correctly. Jesus is not the fulfiller of the Old Testament. He came not to fulfill, but to destroy the law. I absolutely love God because all these heretics and idolaters in the world, they mix their delusions, but also they will speak the truth and tell us what the truth is. So Marcion tells us the truth, that the Old Testament reveals God and it predicts the Jewish Messiah. Now, I must clarify that the Old Testament does not predict, well, actually, it does predict the Jewish Messiah, but it more predicts the Messianic age. The Jewish Messiah is more pronounced in the book of Obadiah. Obadiah is one book, and it's verse 21 of Obadiah that talks deeply about a Messiah. So maybe I'll give it to Marcion and say it predicts a Jewish Messiah, but certainly not a Christos. There's no Christos in the Old Testament. And then it says Jesus is not the fulfiller of the Old Testament. He's correct. He's not, because Jesus is a concoction. Marcion has played a part in creating the New Testament and its gospel. The church in Rome adopts all these things that Marcion has said easily, but they didn't have to even invent them because Marcion had already invented the New Testament. The Old Testament God worked evils. This is according to Marcion. He accuses God of evil and having contradicted himself and delighted himself in wars. This is an insult against God. So we know that Marcion hated the Jews, the Old Testament, and he hated God. Yet he created the New Testament and introduced a new God that satisfied the Gnostic hunger for a new spirituality that is made physical. Jesus was viewed as docetic, in a docetic manner. He only seemed to suffer, yet his death was described as a purchase. Jesus' resurrection was of his soul and spirit, and he raised himself. This is very interesting. It's wrong, but it's very interesting. When it says that Jesus' resurrection was of his soul and spirit, this destroys the Roman Church theology, which is that Christianity is built on the foundation that Jesus raised from the grave. So Marcion is telling us that Jesus never resurrected, and this is profound because it's true. But then it goes on to say that the resurrection was only of his soul and spirit, which means Jesus's body is in a grave somewhere, and that is the absolute truth. The Jewish people have been telling the world this for 2,000 years, but people, because they had been raised in this world of idolatry of the New Testament and Jew hatred, they still blame the Jews for killing Jesus, and they still said that a dead man resurrected from the grave. Marcion even goes as far as says he resurrected himself. Marcion continues to say the physical birth of Jesus was a stumbling block to Marcion. Well, it's not history that's talking. It says a physical birth of Jesus was a stumbling block to Marcion. So he began his gospel in Luke 3 with the statement that in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, Jesus came down from heaven to the Galilean city of Capharnaum or Capernaum. So Marcion didn't believe in the physical birth of Jesus. He looked at Jesus in a superstitious, Gnostic manner, that he was a spirit being among us. But we know that this Jesus never existed, but instead there was a rabbi named Yeshua ben Yosef ben Abraham, upon whom the story of Jesus is imposed. And so he was born physically. He had a physical mother and father. He was not a spiritual being. And then the fifth belief of Marcion says Paul was the only true apostle. This is not true because Marcion's own New Testament tells us that Paul was not a disciple, but he came from the Roman world. The 12, meaning the 12 Jewish disciples of Yeshua ben Yosef ben Abraham, who's accused of being Jesus, they Judaized. So the Father had to call Paul to restore the true gospel, but even his epistles were interpolated with Judaizers. What does this mean? It means that even though they tried to recreate Jewish history and impose Jesus in Jewish history and the gospel against the Torah, their masters, the masters of the church fathers, were still Jewish. And he calls them Judaizers. It's an insult for someone who keeps practicing Torah in the Western world. It's an insult. Because you must remember the world of Marcion and the church fathers, it's the Western world, because the Jews were conquered first by the Greeks and then the Romans. So they're called Judaizers. So in the church, in the Adventist church, if you said, hey guys, let's study the Torah, people will say, no, but that's Judaizing. If you go to any Christian church, you say, hey guys, let's keep the Sabbath. They're going to say, no, 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 you are Judaizing. And you say, well, let's keep the 7 Sabbaths, which are called feasts. No, 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 you are Judaizing, which means you are practicing Torah in a Western world. But thank God, in this Western world, even though the Jews were first slaves or made slaves in this Western world, Jews have thrived. And so my message is to the Jews and the Israelites in the Adventist church that you need to rethink your reformation. Think about where you are. It's not a coincidence that God has put you in Seventh-day Adventism. It's because your forefathers were forcefully converted, but now you must act upon this revelation and come back to the Torah. Marcion took his stand on a written revelation. So Marcion writes the New Testament upon the revelation, and then Marcion also writes the book of Revelation, calling it a revelation. So I've studied theology, Christian theology, and what you understand is that the book of Revelation is the continuation of Matthew 24, I think. Matthew 24 is continued in Revelation. That's what Marcion is busy talking about as the author of the New Testament. His significance in the development of the canon will be assessed in the next chapter. And then, talking about asceticism, Marcion thought that sex was abhorrent. That's very interesting. It's a very interesting thing because in the Greek world and the Roman world, homosexuality was the most important thing to them. Women were for reproduction and not for pleasure or spiritual upliftment. So they saw sex as something dirty that you do to have children, but the real sexual experience for the Westerners back then, and I dare say sometimes today in other societies, is homosexual sex, men with men. Water replaced wine in the Lord's Supper. Well, the Lord's Supper is not a Jewish tradition in any case. We have Erev Shabbat and Kiddush. The Lord's Supper is actually a misunderstanding of a Jewish Erev Shabbat, and also a misunderstanding of what happens at dinner time in the Jewish world. He also said that meat was not good, so everybody should eat fish. And that's why the Roman Catholic Church said for like 180 days in the year, I think, Catholics are not allowed to eat meat. They must eat fish, bacalhau. That's why in Portugal, fish became a national symbol, bacalhau. That's why in Spain, they love mariscos and pulpo, which is octopus and seafood, because the church imposed the fish diet during a certain time of the year. And then number 8, the followers of Jesus are not under the law, which means anyone who follows Jesus is not under the influence of the Torah. Let me put this in plain terms. If you follow Jesus in the New Testament, you deny the character of God, which is in the Old Testament. He called it the law because it's the Torah. So if you don't accept the Torah or acknowledge it, at least, you don't have to become Jewish. But if you don't acknowledge and regard it as a Bible, you are rejecting God, and you're rejecting his authority and kingship over you. Salvation is by grace alone, he says, and grace needs no law. And then Marcion writes this grace versus law theater under the guise of the book of Romans, I think, or Corinthians. Law and grace. Let's go find that debate with law and grace quickly, so that I don't finish the video having sent you to the wrong book. All right, so these law versus grace texts, John 1:17, for the law was given through Moses, grace came through Jesus. We know that this doesn't come from the Jewish world. Marcion is the author of the New Testament by the admission of Christian history. So we'll go with what Christian history says, because that's what it is. So he believed that grace alone could save you, but in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Isaiah, God says that he will save Israel. He's the only savior of Israel. He's the only redeemer of Israel. He's the Goel, which is a kinsman redeemer of Israel. So no one can save, not even Jesus, not even the rabbinic, not even the historic rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef ben Abraham, who's interpreted as Jesus in Marcion's books. Not even he could provide salvation. Only God can provide salvation. All right, this was a brief taste for you of Christian history and the background of Christian beliefs. We're not even dealing with Christian history yet. This is just a taste from Church History Volume 1. This is not Adventist church history. This is general Christian church history. And that impacts Adventism in a big way. So let's go to the Adventists now. Before we go to Elder Waggoner, let's look at our Adventist timeline. Around 1860, 1863, the church is formalized, right? So the remnant of Christianity is given the name Seventh-day Adventist. I want you to understand that this remnant is not of Judaism, or the Jewish world or the Torah. This is a remnant of Christianity. People who didn't understand, who didn't want the Western world and its values and its horrors anymore. So they saw themselves as a remnant of people who are to be redeemed by God. And this is commendable. This is admirable. In 1863, the organization of the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists. Pretty cool. The declaration in 1872, the Declaration of Fundamental Principles taught and practiced by the Seventh-day Adventists, is published at Battle Creek, Michigan, primarily written by James White. Can you see? Who's a pioneer? Not Ellen White. Ellen White never contributed to the beliefs. James White. These fundamentals serve as a synopsis of faith published in a pamphlet. This lays down a clear non-Trinitarian foundation and was not replaced or changed in any way until 1931. These propositions are based on Corinthians 1:8-6 and do not contain the term Godhead or the Trinity, Godhead in the New American version of the Bible. Now, I want you to understand that James White did not believe in the Trinity. So it seems as though, I'm not going to say all the pioneers, we're going to discover this in their books as we develop this series, but for now, you can take home that James White did not believe in the Trinity or the Godhead, so he must have believed in one God. But we will only find out when we interrogate the writings of James White. So in our history timeline, we've moved from 1860 now to 1872. Let's look at Elder Waggoner first. Elder Waggoner wrote a book or had teachings that were known as, is there a title to this? Christ and His Righteousness by Elder Waggoner. This book is a response to 1888. I get that feeling that it's a response to the chaos of the General Conference and the fight among the Adventists of 1888 on what to believe. So he writes, let me see the publication date here. Yeah, this is after 1888. This is 1892. I think I'm correct. So let's go and see what the elder believed in or did not believe in. I'm not going to show you the whole book yet. As we develop the series and we take on certain subject, I'm going to show you snippets of every book. So I'd like to begin with Elder Waggoner, and his writing is Christ God. We know that James White didn't believe in the Trinity. We know that Marcion tried to make people believe that Christ is God. So what did Elder Waggoner, a Christian who comes from the evangelical movement, which comes from the Protestant movement, which comes from the Church of Rome, which comes from the Roman Church, which comes from Marcion and the Church Fathers Church. Two types of Christianity. In many places in the Bible, Christ is called God. So when he says the Bible, he doesn't mean the Jewish Bible, he doesn't mean the Tanakh. This is the Roman Bible. It says, or the Christian Bible, and many times in the Bible, Christ is called God. The psalmist says, the mighty God, even the Lord Yah, hath spoken and called the earth from the rising of the sun until the going down thereof. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God hath shined. Our God shall come and shall not keep silent. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous round about. He shall call all the heavens from above and the earth, that he may judge his people. Gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me, by sacrifice, and the heavens shall declare his righteousness, for God is judge himself. So Elder Waggoner misinterprets Psalm 50 verse 1 to 6, and he says that it is talking about Christ. Remember that Christ and the New Testament, that's an invention of Marcion and Gnosticism. It has nothing to do with the Jewish people. It has nothing to do with King David. So this is the misinterpretation. The only time that God is going to come with the angels is at the end of days, after Messiah has been revealed, after Messiah conquers the Western world and reestablishes Jerusalem and builds a new temple, and then God will descend. It's not the people that are going to heaven. It's heaven coming down to Jerusalem. That's the old and correct and consistent teaching of the Bible. He continues to say that this passage has reference to Christ, but clearly doesn't. But he says it refers to Christ because in his mind, Elder Waggoner is a Westerner and a Christian, and they have been taught that Christ is God. So wherever he sees God and something mildly prophetical, oh, this refers to Christ. And it's not Elder Waggoner's fault. Every Christian thinks like that because every Christian has been conditioned to think like that. By the fact that already learned that all judgment is committed to the Son. This is not true, because judgment is a characteristic of God, the Creator, and it's in the name Yahweh. The name Yahweh is judgment, love, kindness, and grace, and judgment. So Yah or Yahweh, judgment is attached to that name. It's not attached to Yeshua. It's not attached to Jesus. So he says that all judgment is committed to the Son. He's obviously wrong because he has a wrong foundation and understanding of the Bible. And by the fact that it is the second coming of Christ that he sends his angels to gather his elect from the winds. I want to tell you that the second coming is not of Christ. God left the second temple because of a sin called Sinat Chinam among the Jews soon after Cyrus rebuilt Jerusalem and the Jews came back from Babylon. God left because the Jews started hating one another. So when he talks about the Jewish understanding is that it is the second coming of God, because when Messiah builds the third temple, the new temple, the Shekhinah and God will return. That is the second coming, not of Christ, but of God. Our God shall come, says Waggoner, and shall not, is quoting the Bible. Our God shall come and shall not keep silence, is quoting King David, but he's quoting wrong. No, for when the Lord himself descends from heaven, it will be with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. This is extra biblical. This comes from Marcion's Bible, which is 1 Thessalonians. This shout will be the voice of the Son of God, which will be heard by all that are in their graves, and which cause them to come forth. This is still from the New Testament and not from the real Bible, which is the Jewish scriptures. With the living righteousness, they will be caught up and meet the Lord in the air. This is not in Jewish tradition or the Bible. This is the concoction of Gnosticism. The Gnostics believe that they can ascend to God in the physical. You can never ascend to God in the physical. You ascend towards God through the soul in the spiritual. Gnosticism wanted to spiritualize the body and make it physical, but also spiritual. But the Bible teaches us to cultivate our spiritual side because the, the body is corrupt. It will die one day. It's only at the resurrection when our souls are going to be put into new incorruptible bodies. This is actually correct Jewish understanding, a correct Jewish understanding. So no one is going to go up in the sky. It's all rubbish. The heavens are coming down. The new Jerusalem is not coming from the sky. It will be rebuilt by the Jewish people in the age of Messiah at the end of the 6,000 years. So Waggoner, the Adventist pioneer, not through his own fault, but because of the way he was taught faith, the way that he believed, he continued in this erroneous path. A fire shall devour. Before I read that, I want you to feel the pain of the Adventist pioneers. The pain of the Adventist pioneers is they are white people mostly. They have social privileges that Black Adventists don't have. So these are white people who have privileges, social privileges. They are frustrated by the Western world in which they live in. They are tired of war and lies and oppression and kings and all the rubbish of Europe and America. They are tired of this. They start a movement, but their movement has no point of departure. So they go back to the same erroneous Christian scriptures to try and find a way. This is very commendable because the Adventist pioneers were looking for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. What the Adventist pioneers needed was guidance from a Jewish rabbi. And there were many Jews in America and rabbis as to why they did not reach out to the Jews in order to understand the Bible and to understand what they were trying to get at as Adventists who were sick and tired of the Western world. Only God knows. I don't know. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous around about him. For when the Lord JC shall be revealed from the heaven with the mighty angels, it shall be like a flaming fire, taking vengeance, blah, 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 blah. The Messiah doesn't come from the sky. The Messiah comes from among the Jewish people. So this is again Gnosticism, this false prophecy. False prophecy is everywhere in the New Testament because that's the treatise of all the erroneous prophecy. Why did Marcion go as far as hitching a ride on Gnosticism and developing it further? It's because the Greco-Romans were jealous of the Jewish people that they had conquered. The Jews didn't only have history and a land and a God who created all nations, but the Jews had prophets at some stage. So the Gentiles were jealous and wanted their own prophecies and prophets, and that translated to Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is an attempt at prophecy outside the legal Jewish Bible. So that's what Waggoner believed. Waggoner believed, let's go back to the fundamentals that of Adventism. He believed that Christ is God. So the poor soul contributes to Miller's movement. Miller was troubled by themes of eschatology, what will happen at the end times. Waggoner, there's a lot of things that he talks about, but we understand now his theology that he is basically Christology. Even though he wants to be different from the Christians, he cannot be, because the Bible that he has in his hand is not the real Bible, but it's a Bible of Rome, which is the Holy Bible. The Bible of Rome is called called the Holy Bible, and the real Bible that God gave to the people of Israel is called the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which means the law, wisdom writings, and the prophecies or the prophets. So the Adventists were trapped in a Christian world, and they were screaming and dying to get out of it. I'm going to leave this teaching here. We'll come back to Elder Waggoner on other beliefs at some stage. But in the next video, we will look at another Adventist pioneer and the beliefs that they contributed to the movement. If you're a Jew in Adventism, this is time to take seriously the contents of this video. If you're an Israelite, which means you're an African in the United States or in Africa, remember that your heritage is Jewish. Africa was Jewish plus ethnic religions, but mostly in the West Coast, in Southern Africa, parts of Southern Africa and East Africa, it was Jewish, because the Israelites, the 5 or 6 tribes of Israel, came to Africa. So this is talking to you, in other words. That's why you are in the churches or even in Adventism and you don't feel at home. There's a reason why. It's the same reason why I left the church and came back to the original belief of the Bible and to the beliefs of my forefathers, that there is one God. Anyways, this is not evangelism. This is to open your eyes. If you're an Adventist and you're proud of being Adventist, I commend you and I say to you that the pioneers were onto something. Learn what the pioneers wanted through my lectures, so that if that's what you want for yourself, you can access that and finally free yourself, not specifically from the Adventist church, but from the erroneous Bible of Marcion, a person who hated God, the Jews, and everything that is associated with the Torah. I'll see you in the next video. God bless you, lead you, open your eyes, etc., etc. Until the next video.